Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're embarking on, well, one of the most remarkable journeys in all of science, the complete timeline of human development.
You are, and our guide for this is chapter 23 of Gray's Anatomy.
Right. And our mission today is really to translate this incredibly dense, precise text into something you can actually visualize, from the very first cells right through to adolescence.
Exactly. We're going from microscopic stages all the way to gross neonatal anatomy. It's about understanding how clinicians measure and see this process and how these spatial relationships change so dramatically.
It seems like the scope is huge. We have the embryonic period, then the fetal period. But before we even get there, there's this problem of timing, right? Two different clocks.
Yeah, that's the first hurdle. You have what's called menstrual age, which is what clinicians use.
That's the one starting from the last period.
Right. So it comes out to about 280 days or 40 weeks. It's practical, but developmentally, nothing's actually happening until conception.
So we need a more accurate clock for the biology.
We do. And that's the postfertilization age 266 days. That's the gold standard for tracking the actual morphological events, the real changes. And that's the clock we'll be using for these very early stages.
Okay, let's unpack this. Starting with how researchers even classify those first few weeks. I mean, it can't just be a simple measurement.
Absolutely not. You can't just use a ruler. For one, size is really variable at that stage.
And the specimens themselves change, don't they?
They shrink when they're fixed for study. It's just impractical. That's why we use the Carnegie system. It's this incredibly detailed staging system.
Originally by Streeter.
By Streeter, and then refined by O'Reilly and Muller. And the key thing is, it completely ignores size.
So what does it use instead?
It uses internal and external morphological criteria. What structures are present, how developed they are. And that defines 23 distinct stages, taking us right to the end of the embryonic period.
If we trace that initial transformation, what are some of the milestones that really show that incredible speed?
The sheer velocity is breathtaking. Let's try to visualize the limb development. We'll use post-fertilization days, or PFDs.
Okay.
So at stage 13, that's around day 31 to 33, the upper limb bud just appears.
Yeah.
It's just a visible little bump.
Just a bump. And then
the change is almost geometric. By stage 16, which is only a few days later, around day 37, that little bump is already flattened out into a distinct paddle shape.
And I'm guessing the lower limbs are a bit behind schedule.
That's the classic pattern, isn't it? Craniocaudal development, head to tail.
Right.
So by stage 18, maybe day 42, the lower limb is just now forming its own paddle. But if you look back at the upper limb at that exact same time,
What's happening there?
it's already starting to show the first signs of separating digit rays, the outlines of what will become fingers.
So we go from a tiny bump to formed fingers and toes in, what, less than a month?
And less than 4 weeks. And that takes us to the big threshold, stage 23.
And that's the end of the embryonic period?
It is. Around day 53 to 58, the whole transformation is basically complete. The head is rounded, almost erect, eyelids are forming, and the fingers and toes are totally separate. You even have bone marrow formation starting in the humerus.
And the staging isn't just about, cataloging history. It actually maps out vulnerability.
It absolutely does. You can think of the timetable of development as a clinician's roadmap for risk. Because the Carnegie system tracks everything at once, you can see precisely when, say, the heart's ventricles are forming.
And that's the window of greatest danger.
That is the narrow window when that specific system is most susceptible to a teratogenic insult, something that could cause a structural birth defect.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Once we're in the fetal period, how do obstetricians talk about timing? It's more than just the 3 trimesters, right?
Oh, much more. They need far more granular definitions, especially around the time of birth. Term is defined as 37 up to 42 weeks postmenstrual.
And before that is preterm.
Preterm, yes, but even that gets subdivided. Very preterm is 28 to 32 weeks, and extremely preterm is anything under 28 weeks. And survival, long-term outcomes, they all depend heavily on which category a neonate is in.
And the terminology keeps going, even after birth.
It has to. For tracking health outcomes, the perinatal period is a very specific window, from week 24 up to just 7 days after birth. Then you have the broader neonatal period, which is birth to 28 days. These definitions are what let us measure infant health on a population scale.
And all of this precision really depends on imaging. So let's step into that ultrasound room for the big second trimester scan, usually around 18 or 20 weeks.
Yeah, this scan is like a moment of truth. for dating the pregnancy and for detecting any anomalies,
Mm-hmm.
and there are 4 essential measurements.
And the technician has to get them just right.
Perfectly. The plane of section has to be exact for each one. If you're off by even a millimeter, the whole timeline can be thrown off.
So give us the anchor points for the skull, for example.
For the biparietal diameter, BPE, and head circumference, HC, you need a single specific transverse plane. It has to slice right through 2 key structures in the center of the brain, the third ventricle and the thalami.
And that ensures you're measuring the widest part.
The true maximum width, exactly.
Okay, next up, the one for tracking growth. Abdominal circumference.
Right, the abdominal circumference, or AC. This is measured in a transverse plane that shows the widest part of the fetus's liver.
What are the landmarks for that one?
To be sure it's reproducible, the image has to show the symmetric lower ribs and the exact junction where the left and right portal veins meet.
Why is that one so important for growth?
Because the AC reflects soft tissue, fat deposition. So it's highly sensitive to things like malnutrition or growth restriction later in the pregnancy.
And finally, the skeletal anchor.
That's the femur lengths, or FL. And you only measure the ossified part of the bone, the diaphysis and metaphysis. All 4 are vital, but after about 15 weeks, the BPD is usually the best single predictor of the delivery date.
It's just incredible how far this has come. We're not just diagnosing anymore, are we? We're actually intervening.
We are. It's a profound shift.
Yeah.
We've been able to detect things like anencephaly for a while, but now with tools like ultrafast MRI at 20 weeks or so.
Which gives you better soft tissue detail.
So much better. It's especially good for subtle neural tube defects.
Mm-hmm.
And having that precise picture allows for these extraordinary procedures like fetal surgery for meningomyosal.
And there's that XIT procedure. The logistics of that are just stunning.
They really are. The ex utero intrapartum treatment, you've got the mother in a modified C-section, the baby's partially delivered, but still attached to the placenta.
Which is the life support system.
Right. It keeps the fetus oxygenated while the surgeons work. It gives them a window to perform a complex repair before the baby has to breathe on its own. The imaging for that has to be absolutely flawless.
Let's move from staging to the dynamics of growth itself. The sources are really clear that growth isn't just a steady climb.
That's right. Growth has these really distinct phases of speed up and slow down. It's fastest in utero, then rapid in infancy, slows way down in childhood, and then boom, you get the adolescent growth spurt.
And how do we even chart this?
Well, there are 2 main ways. You have longitudinal studies, which are the ideal. You follow the same people for years, decades even.
But those are hard to do.
Very hard. So more often we use cross-sectional studies. You take a snapshot, measuring thousands of different kids at different ages to get averages. That's the data that fills the grace charts you see, with the centiles and the 50th centile as the median.
What's fascinating here is the speed isn't constant across all the different parts of the fetus.
No, not at all. The fetus prioritizes. If you look at the velocity curves, different parts peak at wildly different times. Take estimated fetal weight. The growth rate for that peaks really late, around 35 postmenstrual weeks.
That's the big final weight gain.
That's the final push. But the nervous system, that gets its sprint much, much earlier.
I was going to say the head must be different.
Totally different. The velocity for head growth, so BPD and HC, peaks way earlier, around 13 to 14 weeks. And then its growth rate slows right down. It's all about securing that neurological infrastructure first.
And the abdomen.
The abdominal circumference actually has a second acceleration later on, between 27 and 31 weeks. That's linked to laying down subcutaneous fat and liver glycogen stores for birth.
And we even see these subtle influences, like from assisted reproductive techniques, which can change those early growth curves. It just shows how sensitive this process is.
It's incredibly sensitive. And those influences continue right up to the moment of delivery. The way a baby is born has a profound impact.
We tend to focus on the mechanics of it, but it affects the lungs, the gut.
A huge effect. A baby born by cesarean section, for instance, tends to clear fluid from the lungs more slowly. That can increase the risk of respiratory distress syndrome.
But the bigger deal is the microbiome, right?
That's the critical part. A C-section bypasses all that exposure to maternal, vaginal, and colonic bacteria. It fundamentally changes the baby's initial gut microbiome.
And that can have long-term consequences.
Yes. That initial disturbance has been linked to delayed immune development and even increased risks for things like asthma and type 1 diabetes down the line.
Which is why breast milk is so important.
And why the text really hammers home the importance of enteral feeding. Human milk has secretory IgA, cytokines, and these oligosaccharides that act as prebiotics. It all helps to rapidly mature the gut and build a protective microbiome.
So once we have this full-term neonate, their internal anatomy is still so different from an adult's. We need to really picture this. What are the key spatial differences?
The neonate is organized around its priorities. First, the liver is disproportionately massive. It just dominates the upper abdomen.
So you have to picture the rib cage.
And the lower border of the lung actually sits below the upper border of the liver. It's really compressed in there.
What else stands out?
The kidneys are often still lobulated, not smooth yet. And the two prerenal glands, the adrenals, are conspicuously large, sitting right on top of them. In the pelvis, the bladder's apex is still connected to the umbilicus by the urachus.
And it's worth just quickly remembering where all the different parts of the skeleton come from, embryologically.
That's a great point. It's a subtle but crucial insight, because defects often follow those lines.
Right.
The skull bones come from neural crest mesenchyme, the vertebrae and ribs from paraxial mesenchyme, but the limbs come from somatocleric mesenchyme. It explains why an insult might affect the arms but spare the spine. They're governed by different pathways.
Okay, finally, let's take the long view, postnatal growth, and this principle of allometric growth.
Right. This is fundamental. Growth is allometric, meaning body parts grow at different rates. It's not isometric, where everything just gets proportionally bigger.
The head is the classic example.
The ultimate example is nearly half the length of the embryo, a quarter of body length at birth, and then only about an eighth of your total height as an adult. Meanwhile, the limbs grow much faster relative to the trunk later on.
And these different growth rates for different tissues continue for years.
For decades. General body growth follows one curve, but other systems are on their own schedule. The brain and head grow like crazy early on and then plateau.
And lymphoid tissue is a weird one.
It is. Lymphoid tissue, like the thymus, grows and grows until it peaks around puberty, and then it actually shrinks. It undergoes involution. The reproductive organs, on the other hand, do almost nothing until that massive acceleration during adolescence.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it seems like this whole trajectory is a constant conversation between genetics, hormones, and the environment. There's a term for that, isn't there?
There is. It's known as canalization. The body is always trying to guide growth along a predetermined genetic pathway, but it's constantly being nudged by other factors.
And that starts right after birth.
Immediately.
Yeah.
You even see this hormonal surge in the first few weeks, sometimes called mini-puberty, which helps program later development. It proves the process is just continuous.
And that final familiar adolescent growth spurt, that's also asymmetrical.
It is, in both timing and size. Girls peak earlier, around age 12, and gain about 16 centimeters. Boys peak later, around 14, but they gain more, about 20 centimeters. And most of that extra height for boys comes from growth in the trunk.
Which is why, clinically, you'd look at bone age.
Exactly. Bone age from a wrist x-ray is a much better predictor of pubertal timing than just looking at their chronological age.
That brings us to the end. What a sweep. We've gone from the precision of Carnegie staging and the vital importance of getting those biometric planes for BPD and AC just right.
All the way through to the neonate's transition and how something like delivery mode can have these long-term consequences.
And finally, to this non-uniform allometric nature of growth that shapes us throughout our entire lives.
I think the key clinical takeaway is just how important it is to understand these specific anatomical relationships, why the neonatal liver is so huge, why the growth peaks for the head and the abdomen are so far apart. It's all about how canalization makes every person's growth journey unique.
The source material brings up the fetal origins of adult disease hypothesis, linking low birth weight to a higher risk of cardiovascular disease later on. So that leaves us with a question to think about. In our modern world, with the epidemic of maternal obesity, how are the corresponding fetal adaptations like accelerated growth and altered placental metabolism shaping the next generation's long-term health risks for things like metabolic syndrome and chronic disease?
That is a critical question for modern medicine. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into human growth and the anatomical basis of development.